Hey guys, welcome to the review video for Unit 1, Basic Geographic Concepts. I'm going to try to keep this under 10 minutes. We're going to go through this quickly. What I want to do is give you the stuff you need to study for tonight, things you need to know. Okay, I'm not going to redo the entire lecture. This is almost like a study guide in a sense. So anything I talk about, that is fair game for the test, along with anything from the chapters you've read, the key issues, things like that in Chapter 1, and stuff that was on the quiz for this unit. So make sure you're prepared. Okay, let's start off. Okay, how geographers gather information. You need to know about remote sensing, what it is, the satellite images taken of the Earth. You need to understand how GPS works, or the purpose of GPS, and what GIS is. That's going to be more critical for this test, the idea of taking information from satellite images, making multi-layered maps, and putting lots of information in those maps. Okay, so make sure you understand the concept of GIS. Ways to collect data. You want to know the difference between field studies and case studies. Remember, field studies are done in the field when a geographer goes into the field and researches firsthand what they're going after, and a case study is when you look at something after the fact. Like, for example, we looked at Rwanda, we looked at Czechoslovakia, we looked at Yugoslavia after the fact. Those were case studies. You need to know what a census is, how it's conducted, when it's conducted, okay, and the fact that it's very expensive, and what's the purpose for a census. It's to collect demographic information on a specific place. Okay, surveys. You need to understand why surveys are biased and how they're biased. Understand things like non-response bias, undercoverage, leading questions. Understand that, remember, someone always paid for a survey. So when you look at survey results, you have to ask yourselves, who conducted this survey? What was the overall purpose for it? Because usually it's meant to prove a point one way or the other. Toponymy. Understand what toponymy is. Okay, the study of place names. You don't need to know all the funny place names. Just understand what the concept of toponymy is. You need to know about location. Absolute, relative. Those are pretty simple. We've gone over those a lot. Make sure you know those two things. Understand site versus situation. Site being the factors inside a place, like a place's natural resources, its infrastructure, its cultural landscape, all the things inside a place, versus situation, which is what surrounds a place, okay? The idea of what a place is situated within, like its bodies of water, whatever the case may be. Okay, regions. Understand the concept of a cultural landscape. Remember, cultural landscape is a combination of the actual physical environment, what God put there, versus what man has put there. Of course, including what man has put there. It's a combination of the two, okay? Combination of the two. Types of regions, the ones you need to know. Formal, okay, otherwise known as uniform and homogeneous. Functional, otherwise known as nodal, and vernacular, otherwise known as cognitive and perceptual. Remember, a formal region is a region that has at least one characteristic in common throughout. You have physical characteristics throughout, places like a desert, or you have political formal regions that have a political characteristic, like laws, like the state of Georgia is a political formal region. A functional region is a place that has a center point where the characteristics in that region are strongest in the center, and the further away you go, the less common the characteristics are going to be. Like, for example, the allegiance to a professional sports team, or newspaper circulation, or a radio station. These are all functional regions. Vernacular regions are a little bit more difficult to comprehend. Vernacular regions are ones that are really kind of up to the person who is describing it. Okay, if I were to ask you, what is the South? Where does the South start and stop? Is it Texas? Is it Virginia? Is it Missouri? Is Florida part of the South? Things like that. There really isn't a right answer, because the vernacular region is how you perceive it, how you think of it. Okay, so make sure you understand that. Also, don't forget what mental maps are, and don't forget what activity space is, the area that a person travels on a day-to-day basis, what their routine is, okay? Like, for example, your activity space would be your home, school, and whatever extracurricular activity you participate in. All right, scale. Remember, large scale versus small scale. Remember, global scale versus local scale. Those are pretty self-explanatory. We've talked about them a lot. Remember, if we're talking about maps, the more zoomed in, large scale. The more zoomed out, small scale. Okay, if we're talking about a study like global scale versus local scale, a global scale study is the entire world. Local scale study is a very specific place. Okay, globalization and local diversity. These are very important. You need to know these. They're the two most important topics in this course. Remember, globalization, the idea that culture or cultural elements are spreading throughout the world. Ideas, values, beliefs, things like that are becoming more and more common throughout the world because of interconnectedness, versus local diversity, the idea that certain places hold on to a very specific part of their culture, okay, or their entire culture, and it's unique to themselves, okay? They're locally diverse. Remember, these are competing forces, okay? Because globalization, just in its nature, kills the concept of local diversity. And in order for local diversity to survive, it cannot allow globalization to creep in. Okay, culture. Remember what culture is, okay? It's basically the way people live, guys. We can go very, very broad, very, very detailed in that definition, but the broad strokes of that definition is the way people live, their food, their dress, their language, their faith, whatever. The way a group lives is their culture. Cultural hierarchy. Remember, we go from trait to complex system, region, then all the way down to realm. Trait's very specific. Okay, one behavior. Cultural realm is an area of the earth, very large, that practices similar cultural traits. Know what a cultural hearth is. Cultural hearth, the idea that there is one place where a cultural trait begins, and that is its hearth, its birthplace. When we start talking about the spread of culture, there's two main forms of before we get into specific types of diffusion, two forms of cultural spread, of diffusion that you need to know about, and that's acculturation and assimilation. Remember, acculturation is when a culture is forced upon a weaker culture by a stronger one. For example, the Spanish coming over and acculturating the natives to speak Spanish, practice Catholicism, dress European, things like that. They force their culture on them. As opposed to assimilation, okay, assimilation is when someone willingly accepts a new culture. For example, a family moving into the United States and then assimilating into U.S. culture. Let's say they came from Korea. When they first got here, they were very Korean. Then as time goes by, they become more and more and more American in regards to their dress, their food, their language, whatever. Now remember something. When you talk about assimilation, almost everything assimilates. The one thing that does not usually assimilate is religious values. Whatever religious values people bring with them from their home culture, from their culture of origination, that's what they usually stick with. Religion doesn't change. But by the third generation, remember, third generation rule, most of the time you see very little to no evidence of the original culture because it's been thoroughly assimilated by whatever new culture those people assumed. Okay, sequent occupants. You need to understand sequent occupants. Sequent occupants is the idea that we can look at a place, look at the cultural landscape of a place, and identify the people that used to live there based on how that environment has been changed. Okay, the example we gave was Spain, how you could see the evidence of the Romans, the Arabs, and now the Spanish. But you can look at a place and tell what groups have been there by the cultural landscapes that they've left behind. Okay, diffusion. Remember, diffusion is a big topic. Two different types of diffusion, expansion and relocation. Those are the big two categories. Expansion, relocation. Expansion stays strong in the hearth, relocation gets weak in the hearth. And as we go through this, we'll get a little bit more detail on each one. But remember that, strong in the hearth for expansion, weak in the hearth for relocation. When you talk about expansion diffusion, what we're really talking about is an idea or a concept that spreads in the way that it grows continuously larger. More and more people adopt it, resulting in an expanded area of people who practice that particular trait. There's three types of expansion diffusion you need to know. Number one, hierarchical. This is one that spreads from a smaller group to a bigger group to a bigger group to a bigger group. It starts with oftentimes the elite, not necessarily, but a smaller group that it's specifically intended for, and then it goes through that group before it enters the next group. An example we gave of this was Facebook. Facebook started at Harvard, it diffused through Harvard, then it went to the Ivy League schools, it diffused to the Ivy League schools, then it went to all college campuses, diffused through college campuses, and then it diffused through the general public. Okay? It went from a smaller group to a larger group, hierarchically from top to bottom. Okay? There's other examples of fashion, hip hop, any very expensive technological innovation we just spread from the wealthy down, things like that. Okay, expansion diffusion 2 is contagious diffusion. Contagious diffusion is the spread of an idea, trait, or concept through a group equally without regard for power or social status, something like that. Okay, think of this like gossip, okay? Gossip will start at its hearth and spread out, and basically everybody has an equal opportunity to hear it, okay? This is more of a spread where it spreads evenly as opposed to you have to be part of a specific group to get this trait. Okay, it spreads like the flu, however the flu is not a good example of it because the flu is not a cultural trait, it's an illness. That's about it. Contagious diffusion. Pretty simple. Stimulus diffusion is when a trait goes to a new place, but in order to be adopted in that new place, it has to be tweaked, has to be changed. So the examples we gave, and we talked about this a lot, McDonald's in India changing to all chicken as opposed to beef. Sesame Street going to new countries and changing their language, changing their format and their cast to reflect the cultural standards of that particular place. Okay, relocation diffusion, the other big category. Relocation diffusion is much simpler. It's when people move to a new place and take their traits with them. Okay? It's that simple. It's not the spread of a trait by itself. This trait doesn't go by itself. It has to be contained within a group of people. For example, the Amish moving from Pennsylvania to Kentucky. Now we have Amish people in Kentucky. Not because new people in Kentucky became Amish, because the Amish from Pennsylvania moved to Kentucky. They took their culture with them. Okay, if you look at Mexican immigrants in Texas that have a Mexican culture, practice a Mexican culture, it's because they brought that with them from Mexico. It's a culture that comes with someone from an old place to a new place. All right, migrant diffusion. Migrant diffusion is one that doesn't really fit into either of the two big categories. It has traits of both. For example, if you look at a cultural trait such as the spread of disco music. It was popular in the United States, then it spread, and once it spread, it died in the hearth. Okay, we also call migrant diffusion donut diffusion, but if you write it on an FRQ, write the right word, write migrant diffusion. It's when a trait starts in the hearth, spreads out, and as it spreads out, it dies in the hearth, so it creates a donut-like shape, where it's popular all around the hearth, but not in the hearth. Okay, remember, this really doesn't fit into relocation or expansion diffusion perfectly. A lot of people would say relocation because it dies in the hearth, but there's no movement of people. So I would kind of look at this almost as a hybrid of the two. Let's see, barriers to diffusion. You have cultural barriers. Okay, cultural barriers are things like religion. Okay, any type of cultural taboo that would stop people from adopting a new culture. For example, thank you guys. Anything that would stop people from practicing a new cultural trait. For example, if you were Muslim, you're not going to start eating pork. If you were Mormon, you're not going to start drinking alcohol. Regardless of how the culture is spreading, people don't do new things if there's cultural barriers to stop them. Also physical barriers, but as we've learned in the reading and in class, physical barriers in regards to distance or anything like that are not as big a deal anymore because of technology. Time distance decay, we talked about that a lot. Remember the idea that...
Kim, please come to PPO.
Sorry.
Chase, Kim, to PPO.
The idea that the further away you are from something, the less likely you're going to adopt that cultural trait. That used to be the case when you had people who didn't interact worldwide, but now with advances in transportation technology and in communications technology, time distance decay is not as big a deal anymore because of space-time compression. Space-time compression being the idea that technology and advances in transportation have shrunk the world, right? So now if there's a cultural trait that's being adopted in China, you might hear about it because it's on YouTube, or you might have traveled to China because you can get to China in 24 hours on a plane. Things like that have really kind of changed the world we live in and shrunk the world in a sense, okay? So this idea of space-time compression has shrunk the world and allowed for time distance decay to not be as big a factor as it used to be. Okay, sorry this video is late getting posted. We had some technological issues, technical difficulties over the weekend. So hopefully you'll have this for tonight. Good luck with it. Hope this helps. Good luck on your test.